Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of The Ghost Furnace. I am Bond, and I am not with my cohort Nick Pennsylvania tonight, but I am here with my new friend Tim Grieve-Carlson. How you doing, Tim?
Brendan, not too bad. Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely, man. No, we're really excited to have you. Tim, I first learned about whenever he wrote a book on Johannes Kelpius titled American Aurora. And I was really excited when I first heard you speaking about this book, and then after I got it and looked it up, realized we had actually talked back and forth already. Tim, you're an assistant professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy up at Westminster College, which is pretty close to us. We're just a few counties apart and everything. We've been kind of chatting back and forth and everything, both about Kelpius, but about just kind of folklore in general. And you've brought up a few things that we're going to be talking about tonight. This isn't, like I said, this isn't going to be the only time we have you on this show, because we do want to do a Kelpius centric episode at some point once I make it the whole way through the book. But tonight we wanted to talk about Henry Shoemaker, which I'm really excited about because, as a lot of you out there know, me and Nick reference Shoemaker all the time. And as with a lot of things we reference all the time, we don't do great deep dives into them until we're too far in. We're almost 100 episodes in, and the fact that we haven't done a Shoemaker specific episode is kind of crazy. So whenever you mentioned that you were doing some of this work with your students, I was super excited to talk to you about Shoemaker. What we kind of want to do tonight is just kind of go over who Shoemaker is, kind of what his folklore means to people in Pennsylvania and to folkloric studies in general, and just kind of like really give people a good idea of who Shoemaker was and what his work kind of means to everybody. So do you want to go ahead and give an overview of just who Shoemaker was and why he's important enough for us to be talking about him in the first place?
Yeah, sure. So Henry W. Shoemaker, lots of firsts associated with this guy's name. He was Pennsylvania's first state folklorist, and actually the first state folklorist in any state.
Okay.
He was he was also a diplomat. He was briefly appointed minister to Bulgaria for a few years. As
Okay.
we're going to talk about this a little bit, but he was pretty politically active throughout his life.
Mm-hmm.
And like a lot of activists, he kind of got this nominal appointment as minister to Bulgaria as a result of some of his political work. But really, who Shoemaker was and what he's best remembered for today is he was a prolific author of books of folklore and natural history about Pennsylvania, most of which were written during this kind of burst of creativity from about 1900 to about 1920. And there's a lot of stuff that happened after that in his writing, but that was when most of his big folklore publications happened. And Shoemaker kind of lived and wrote at this unique time in American history, but also in Pennsylvania's history. Turn of the 20th century, the lumber boom is kind of not come and gone, but it's really at its peak, right? So
Mm-hmm.
this is the period of what, landscape historians or environmental historians would just call the Pennsylvania desert, when
Right.
Pennsylvania had been logged so thoroughly that there was really not a whole lot of forest left. It really looked almost nothing like it looks today.
Mm-hmm.
Photographs of the state from that period. It's also kind of the peak of like the wider global industrial revolution, when many people who had been living in relatively sustainable, and I mean that both environmentally but also economically, like
Mm-hmm.
sustainable agricultural lifestyles. You were basically able to earn a living by growing some food, working a job locally to make some money. This sort of thing became not really tenable by the 19th century, and many people had to move to cities and take up jobs in factories. This didn't just happen in Pennsylvania, it was happening all over the world, but it really happened in Pennsylvania too. And so what the results of this were kind of twofold. First of all, the natural environment in Pennsylvania was really severely degraded in a way that it in some ways recovered from, and in some ways really hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And Shoemaker writes about this a lot in his folklore, but also in this work of natural history. He has a few books about the extinct animals of Pennsylvania. So wolves, mountain lions, different kind of animals that have gone extinct. And these are both historical works, but also kind of like almost elegiac works, kind of
Mm.
saying like what has been and what we've lost. right?
Kind of
Um,
romanticizing that past
certainly.
already. Yeah, very
Yeah,
recent past.
he was a huge romanticist. But he's better remembered today for his folklore stuff. So Brendan, I think, we talked about this a little bit already, but if if you're a person who's interested in Pennsylvania natural history or folklore, you're going to run into something by Henry Shoemaker pretty quickly. He's still a
Hmm.
pretty well-read, prominent figure. And also, I think, interestingly, a generation of people who wrote in the decades after him really cited him a lot. So his stories come up in books by other people too.
Hmm.
So his work really has legs. What makes it really kind of interesting and worthwhile, I think, is the way that his folklore practice kind of reflected his interest in the ecology of Pennsylvania, the environment of Pennsylvania, and really what he saw as this urgent problem of environmental degradation, species extinction, and this irretrievably lost traditional lifestyle that he saw ending at the turn of the 20th century. So Henry Shoemaker, and feel free to interrupt me because
Yeah.
I can go on and on. Yeah,
No,
he's
you're good. Yeah.
he's born in New York City, in a pretty wealthy family. He really kind of comes up in a privileged background, and a privileged, especially financial background.
Hmm.
Lives in New York, but his family has a summer camp in Center County, and camp is probably like a humble way of
Right.
describing what they had in Center County. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so he spends every summer out in Center County as a young person, and he just absolutely falls in love with it. He loves mountain climbing, he loves hiking, he loves talking to old people, just
Hmm.
kind of like hearing stories. And this really sort of sets up his folklore practice. So by the time he is in college, he starts submitting stories that he is recording in Pennsylvania to his professors, and the results are kind of mixed, but some of them are like, hey, this is kind of interesting. You should
Hmm.
keep writing these and maybe try to publish something. And this is exactly what Shoemaker does. This is the turn of the 20th century. It's about, we're in the 1890s at this point. Shoemaker is not a trained folklorist. He's not anthropology, sociology, folklore are still very, very young
Mm.
disciplines in this day. And Shoemaker is trained in none of them. What he is just a very good writer and a very kind of well-traveled person in Pennsylvania. He knows Pennsylvania fairly well. So he has this interest in traditional Pennsylvania stories, and he has this urgent kind of political sense that really, today we would just call like progressive politics.
Hmm.
He thinks that industrialization is pushing people into lifestyles that are ultimately not good for them. He is not what we would call an environmentalist today. He's more of a conservationist. He thinks that
Hmm.
wild places are actually like spiritually good for people, and that
Hmm.
destroying them is a mistake, not only because it degrades the natural environment but because it destroys something that human beings actually need, like spiritually.
Right. There's layers there. It's not just that certain. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And so this is these sort of political commitments are really the thing that motivates almost all of Shoemaker's writing. And once you kind of hear those two things, first, his kind of anti-industrialist, almost anti-modernist, Brendan,
Hmm.
kind of
Yeah.
perspective, he really thinks that human beings are starting to live in a way that is maybe not good for them. He thinks that in some ways, sort of traditional rural life ways have some kind of spiritual value that unfortunately we're losing. And he thinks that environmental degradation is a serious problem that we're not really paying attention to. And these political commitments follow throughout his whole life, his professional life, but they really animate his folklore work and his folklore collecting in ways that I think make it much more interesting than just a collection of stories that he recorded. He really has this political bone to pick in almost all of his writing.
Yeah, and it's interesting because wasn't his mother, if I remember correctly, was either she involved in railroads or came from a family that was like railroad specific, maybe?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I actually do not remember off the top of my head. But I Shoemaker 100% came from wealth and privilege.
Right. So I wonder
Yeah,
if there was any backlash there between being anti-industrialist coming from a privileged family, that
sure.
may have directly benefited from said industry. So yeah,
Yeah, that's a big question.
yeah, because I mean, I feel like you see that not a lot with environmentalists. Well, again, like you say, he's not really an environmentalist, but he's more of a conservationist. But I just think that's an interesting setting for his kind of like blossoming into this folklorist tradition.
Certainly. Yeah, and so the work he ends up producing is part of what really attracted me to Shoemaker in the first place, and I think continues to attract me to Shoemaker is so much of his work is about like supernatural folklore,
Mm-hmm.
ghost stories, werewolf stories,
Mm-hmm.
stories about kind of mysterious animals. His books are full of this stuff, and what makes it, I think, really interesting is often his supernatural stories are also kind of environmentalist in their outlook in certain
Mm-hmm.
ways. So one story that I really, really love is it's called In the Foothills, and it's from a book he wrote. I think it was 1915. I might be off. It's somewhere in the 19 teens, but it's called Susquehanna Legends. All of these books are available online for free, by the way.
Yeah.
Pretty readily. Shoemaker's work is all out of copyright, so anybody listening can just go pick it up. But In the Foothills is a story that Shoemaker says that he recorded near Troxelville, Pennsylvania, which is down in Snyder County, kind of
Oh,
just
okay.
south of Center County, south of kind of Penn State region. And it's a story where Shoemaker says, I was relaxing one night at a hunter camp, and I was spending time with this man, Old Man Rao is his name, and he started telling this panther story. And in the story, then Shoemaker immediately kind of launches into Old Man Rao's voice, kind of telling this.
Mm-hmm.
And he does this thing that a lot of great folklorists do, which is he preserves kind of the personality of the storyteller in the telling.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about this a little bit later, but I think part of what makes his work so long-lived is he's a really great writer and he's able to preserve the quality of a person's voice in his writing. And so Old Man Rao tells this story about a man he knows, a hunter named Jake, who shoots and kills a panther near his farm. This was a time when the panther population was dwindling, and Shoemaker sets this frame to the story where he has Old Man Rao say, Old Man Rao is talking about this other gentleman, Jake, who shot and killed the panther. Old Man Rao says, looking back, we didn't really understand that exterminating all the panthers would trigger all of these problems with other animals. We didn't have and he mentions a specific disease that's afflicting pheasants. And he says all of the game now is kind of sick and slow and weak and not very good. And and Old Man Rao, Shoemaker's character, says, looking back, the panther wasn't really a varmint. It kind of held everything together.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the frame, right? That's like the very
Right.
beginning. What is actually about to be a really kind of amazing story about a ghost panther is set in this sort of like ecological lens, right?
Yeah.
Where the really scary thing is not the ghost of a panther, but an ecosystem that has started unraveling at the top. And
Mm-hmm.
now it's not going to behave in ways that are predictable or can sustain human life reliably. And so, yeah, I'll just, summarize,
Yes.
part of the story. But yeah, Jake shoots and kills this panther, and Jake is he's kind of a weird dude. He's kind of like a goofball, and he stuffs it himself, and he doesn't do a very good job.
Oh,
And
jeez.
he puts the stuffed panther on the roof of his shed, kind of just for kicks.
Mm-hmm.
And some people are like, yeah, that's cool, and some people are like, that's kind of weird. I wish you wouldn't do that. Um, but he's a goofball and he kind of wants his trophy. But what happens is this panther's mate starts to hang around town and
Oh,
sort of like
jeez.
circle the shed and kind
Mm-hmm.
of like approach the town. People really want Jake to take his stuffed panther down because it's bringing this other panther into town. He refuses and he actually says, I'm going to get the other one of these days too. I'm actually using this panther to kind of lure it in. One night, the a pack of or a group of hunting dogs come back from a hunt before the hunter gets back, and the dogs kind of get the scent of the stuffed panther, and they start trying to get up on top of the shed. They start circling it, barking it, making a huge noise, and eventually one of them actually does get on top of the shed, pulls the panther down, whereupon the panther's mate jumps out, kills the dogs,
Oh my
and
gosh.
drags the stuffed panther back into the woods. I'm glossing a lot of really like beautiful suspenseful writing here.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds a lot better in Shoemaker's telling. There's one part in the story where there's actually a really beautiful sentence I do want to mention where the wife of Jake and his daughter are inside the house, and the wife says to the daughter, I have a bad feeling about tonight. This is the kind of night when people see ghosts. I wish he wasn't out so late tonight. And the daughter says, "Don't say that. Ghosts scare me." And to which her mother responds, "Don't be foolish. We need ghosts just in the same way that we need our daily meals. We cannot reckon without them."
Oof.
End paragraph.
Oof.
And fast forward to Jake gets this hunting party together to pursue this panther and pursue, his taxidermy specimen. Eventually, they come upon what at first they think are two logs near a spring. Upon getting closer, they realize it's actually two panthers. One of them is moving kind of stiffly and awkwardly. All of the men there freeze. They're not able to shoot. They have I forget exactly what Shoemaker calls it, but like deer fever or buck fever, that they have it in their sights, but they can't pull the trigger. The two panthers escape, and that's the end of the story.
Jeez.
About this moment of kind of having the animals in their sights and failing to pull the trigger. But the two things I really want to, first of all, like I said, it actually is a kind of beautiful, exciting story about the hubris of this hunter, Jake,
Hmm.
who not only is a hunter, right, who takes a panther, but he kind of delights in it, right? He's
Hmm.
kind of maybe a little bit too like disrespectful of the
Right.
animals he's hunting. And his not really retribution on him, but the Panthers kind of forcibly reasserting their own sort of like social world in
Right.
the face of that human disrespect, right? Um, I love how that story is kind of set in this frame of Old Man Rao kind of saying, maybe we didn't have to kill all the Panthers. Maybe that was a mistake. I
Right.
also really love the line where the woman says, "We need ghosts. We cannot reckon without them." Right. And I think, it's an old-fashioned way of saying
Hmm.
ghosts kind of, when she says reckon, she means understand. Right.
Right.
And what she's really saying, I think, is ghosts and ghost stories orient us in space, they orient us in time, they orient us in kind of like the meaning that we share with our environment and each other. And so there's in this kind of superficially silly story about a taxidermy panther coming to life, Shoemaker has packed so much other stuff. You know what I mean?
Right.
Ecological stuff, social stuff, stuff about the importance of supernatural folklore. So he's a really wonderful and interesting writer in that way.
So I think, yeah, there's a lot to unpack just with that
Yeah,
story right there, obviously. Kind of moving backwards from like from like a paranormal side to the folklorist side.
yeah.
Um, like some people would frame that as like a ghost story
Mm.
versus like the allegorical side that Shoemaker is obviously trying to like get across. Whenever he was writing that, would people who were reading those stories have looked at them like a true telling of a ghost story, or would it have been understood by the reader that this is an allegory? Like, what was like the, I guess, like media literacy of his audience when they were consuming a story like this?
I actually think that Shoemaker's audience might have been more sophisticated consumers of ghost stories than we are today.
Mm-hmm.
I think they would have been really used to hearing ghost stories traditionally told and told well.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they would have known that the truth is a relative quantity in a ghost story, right? That
Mm-hmm.
there's the truth of, they say that so and so, that this happened to so and so, and it's been told for so long, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
there are some people, and honestly, I'm kind of one of them who, when someone starts telling a ghost story, all of my skeptical faculties just kind of evaporate, and I'm
Right.
completely in the world of the story, right?
Right. Right.
And when I read a Shoemaker ghost story, that's definitely what happens. Like I just sort
Hmm.
of like fully enter the world of the story. And when I step out, of course, I'm able to kind of
Use that
reassess
other
everything.
lens. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But I actually do think, when you look at a lot of, especially supernatural folklore from not only the 19th century, but going backwards, people actually are pretty skeptical, and they're pretty
Hmm.
quick to use phrases like superstition, nonsense, silliness, things like
Hmm.
this. They're pretty quick to dismiss ghost stories, but I think that in some ways, Shoemaker's audience might have been sort of more attuned to the fact that traditional ghost stories often communicate important cultural information than many
Hmm.
listeners today, right? And this is not to knock like everyday people today or people
Oh,
who
right.
listen to
Right.
ghost stories today, but so a huge part of how we exchange ghost stories today, I guess 10 years ago, reality television, and today it's mostly podcasts, right?
Hmm.
Um, but oftentimes those are stories kind of without that sort of like community connection and kind of cultural meaning, right?
Hmm.
Sometimes they have that, right? That's sort of a generalization that might not be true all the time. But I actually think Shoemaker's audience would have had a lot of experience in interpreting like a ghost story, right?
Right. Right.
Um, I think you would have a lot of people kind of like me who are sort of like, wow, that's cool. I
Hmm.
100% believe that. And I think you would have a lot of people who are like, that's a great story. 100% that never happened, right? That a
Right.
taxidermy panther came back to life. But that was a wonderful way for me to spend my Thursday night at the camp around the fire. You know what I mean?
Right. And the framing of the story is such like an important part of it. And I think that him not having, like you said, some of these social sciences weren't developed, or he certainly wasn't studied in them. Maybe he kind of was leaning on the storytelling, that part of the tradition, to kind of get these things kind of across to people. So the whole allegory versus fact thing might not have been that big of a, like, that might be more of a modern lens that we're giving to this. It's so, like, it wouldn't be right for us to think like, oh, everyone who read Shoemaker stories, back in the day was, he was trying to dupe people into thinking the taxidermy panthers were coming back to life. Like,
Yeah.
that probably wasn't the aim nor the effect. you
Right.
know
Right.
and like you said, he was very well. I like the idea of well traveled, comma, in PA or
Yeah.
in Pennsylvania. Whenever he was going around all these different places, collecting these stories, trying to preserve this, kind of cultural history. You mentioned, like, he was talking to a lot of old people, and he just kind of like liked talking to old people. And we've talked on this show quite a bit recently to Jim Harold when he used the line. I think we've lost something between the porch and the patio, um, which I thought was a great line that he had. It seemed like Shoemaker was someone who wanted to sit and listen to talk to people, which is something that we see with a lot of folklorists, is they want to listen more and then they kind of like document and interpret and, kind of retell. What are some other examples of him kind of like trying to like preserve stories versus maybe him trying to write allegories and using these people as a means to tell that story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, part of the reason that Shoemaker is not really taken seriously today as a folklorist by folklorists is
Hmm.
that, as you put it, when a professional folklorist records a story, oftentimes they will just record the story verbatim in their text, and then
Hmm.
they will proceed to sort of context and analysis and their own sort of interpretation of the story. For Shoemaker, it's just a story, and it's often kind of ornately and richly and beautifully put together, right?
Hmm.
And so he's not really using like professional folklore methods, right? He wants to
Hmm.
write a beautiful book that will make the reader care about Pennsylvania as a special wild place that is worth protecting. That's what he wants to do. The stories are a way for him to do that, right?
Right.
And so, for example, in the preface to his book, his first book, Pennsylvania Mountain Stories, he in the preface to I think the fifth edition of the book, he says a lot of people have asked me if these stories are true, and then he says now a lot of them are about supernatural stuff, so they can't really be true, but they were told to me. And then he goes on to say they were told to me during these trips that I took throughout Pennsylvania in these years to these places.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, a lot of great stories were told to me that I just forgot. And a lot of details have kind of slipped too. But out of that sort of like jumble of stuff that I heard during these trips, I produced these stories. So he's kind of saying there, in so
Mm-hmm.
many words, I didn't make any of this stuff up, but it is my creation, kind of,
Right.
right?
So he's kind of like laying out his own version of what like we would call provenance of a story today.
Yeah,
Where I
yeah,
mean, so he's at least being like transparent, it sounds like, in that sense, at least to the point where his audience would have a better context to where this stuff is coming from, you
yeah.
know.
And there are interesting examples where it's hard to tell. And this is the other thing. There's no way to know for certain because Shoemaker never really documented his own field work. He just
Mm-hmm.
wrote books. So usually we can look back at the work of an anthropologist and say, um, Evans Pritchard really did go to Central Africa in the 1920s and work with the Azande, and we're
Right.
able to verify that. Shoemaker never really left any of those records,
Mm-hmm.
and so we kind of just have to trust. Now there are certain places in his stories where trusting him in that way becomes sort of hard, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for example, one of probably his most famous story is the legend of Princess Nittany,
Mm-hmm.
the Native American princess for whom Nittany Mountain is named in State College.
Mm-hmm.
This word Nittany is where that mountain gets its name. It does seem to come from this Shoemaker story.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Which is
Shoemaker,
which is just like a bananas fun fact in
isn't it?
general. Like how
Yeah.
crazy is that?
And so in the story, Shoemaker says that he got this story from an indigenous person named Jake who lived in the area and was a great storyteller. And he had a reputation in the area as a great storyteller, and he names some names, and it really does seem like Jake is a real guy. And I
Mm-hmm.
actually find this dimension of Shoemaker to be super interesting because at the time it was really common to write about indigenous people in the East as being 100% extinct, gone.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you like read any indigenous people or talk to any indigenous people in the East today, it's like, no, not at all. There were still tons of indigenous people
Right.
in the
Right.
Eastern United States. It's just that everyone else decided to collectively pretend that there weren't anymore,
Right.
right?
Right.
And in Shoemaker's stories, pretty consistently, he's focused on that indigenous history and the fact that that indigenous history is not completely gone. There's plenty of indigenous folks still in Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
Ideally, obviously, the indigenous people of Pennsylvania would have not be filtered through Shoemaker, right?
Right.
But I do
Right.
think that's interesting about him that he's not erasing them, and they're a kind of like real presence
Mm-hmm.
in his work. But in this story, Princess Nittany, he says, this was a story originally told to me by old Jake. And the story, I won't try to recount the whole story, but there was this great Native American princess named Nittany who led her people through this catastrophic period of warfare and trial. And she lived a very, very long, happy life. And at the end of her life, she laid down and died, and a burial mound was raised over her. And that night, there was a storm unlike any storm that has ever been seen before or since in the Nittany Valley. And when the sun came up, her burial mound had become an enormous mountain, and that is Mount Nittany. So that story, it has become like, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say like a myth for Penn State, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, for sure.
if you look up the Mount Nittany Conservancy, they'll say this story is probably not true. This story is also the main reason that we've been able to protect Mount Nittany from
Like that's
deforestation
the
and any other
duality
kind
right
of,
there.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's no way to know if Shoemaker really did know a guy named Jake who told him that
Mm-hmm.
story, or if Shoemaker kind of wanted to just write a myth for Penn State, right?
Right.
kind of in the same way, maybe not the same, but in a way that sort of rhymes with like when Tolkien is asked about the Lord of the Rings, is it an allegory, is it whatever, he'll say it's a myth for England.
Right.
That
Yeah.
England,
Famously. Yeah.
after Christianity, England didn't have any myth, and he wanted to write a myth for it. Shoemaker is kind of doing the same with
Mm-hmm.
Penn State and this Legend of Nittany. So there, it's really clear that we're not, maybe there was a guy named Jake. Maybe that is
Right.
a traditional story. There's no way to know for sure. There's no doubt that Shoemaker was a tremendously creative writer,
Mm-hmm.
and a romantic writer, and sort of someone who certainly would make his stories extremely kind of like ornate and flowery and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so he presents this challenge, and this is kind of why I like teaching him, right? Because with
Right.
the Legend of Princess Nittany, is the story true? We straight up, well, is the story true that this ancient princess, her burial mound became a mountain? Question mark. Did Shoemaker actually gather this traditional story? We
Mm-hmm.
don't know, right? But
Right.
to some extent, that's not really what's important. Shoemaker wanted to create a sort of mythic imaginary for Penn State, and that just
Mm-hmm.
worked.
Right.
This story
Right.
was put down on paper, and that mountain has not been logged, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a beautiful conservancy,
Mm-hmm.
um, that has been like pretty well protected and cherished for a century at this point. So yeah, like you use the phrase duality, like there's something more important than like factual truth in Shoemaker's writing, right? It's the ability of stories to make places special and valuable
Mm-hmm.
in a way that you otherwise can't.
Right. It's it kind of reminds me of like just because we're talking about, conservation and things like that. It almost kind of reminds me of like because I heard someone back in the day trying to fact check Silent Spring by Rachel Carson on
Mhm.
some of like her because if anyone's actually read the book, like it's a lot of real technical stuff on how these chemicals work and everything. And there are things in there that are not 100% true because they have now been proven to be different one way or the other. Usually, in most cases, considerably worse than even she could have imagined. Um, but that shouldn't be what people take away from reading Silent Spring. Like, oh,
Mhm.
her understanding of how dioxides work was a little bit off.
Right.
Like that's like, I think you're kind of missing it here, Bob. Um,
Yeah.
so so I think with someone like Shoemaker, like he had a means, or he used these stories as a means to an end to, like you said, kind of romanticize this natural history and its intersection with folklore and people's stories to kind of like do something to stir things in people. So again, I kind of go back to this modern lens of us seeing that doesn't necessarily negate him as important. It might not be folklore in the way that we now talk about how it should be documented and how it should be kind of retold to
Mhm.
people. But that wasn't even his purpose back then. So it really isn't fair for us to use that lens to judge his works by.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. The scholar who really helped me understand Shoemaker in this way is a folklorist at Penn State Harrisburg named Simon Bronner, who wrote a really great book called Popularizing Pennsylvania, which is
Mm,
a biography of Shoemaker and a kind of like reading of Shoemaker's work. And he was really the person to sort of like point this out about Shoemaker, that Shoemaker's real goal in his writing was basically political, and not political in the
hmm
sense that like he was a partisan, but political in the sense, like I've already said, he
hmm
he had this, not fully, he was not an anti-modernist. He wasn't even fully an anti-industrialist. He really thought that the destruction of wild places was going to be like an irretrievable disaster for people. He really
hmm
thought, and this was based on his childhood experience hanging out in Center County and just running around in the woods. He thought that when we lose that, we're losing something that is really crucial to us. I also think that, we talked a little bit about he enjoyed listening to people, he enjoyed listening to older people.
hmm
In his writing, we really get this sense that kind of slower, more rural, traditional lifeways are a little bit better for people than urban, industrial, kind of faster paced
hmm
lifeways. That's his perspective. around this time, right, this is also a period where fast-paced industrialization, urbanization are all kind of contributing to what, sociologists today would call alienation, right?
Right.
Everyone is working in factories. No one is really, everyone is working way more than they used to. No one is
Hmm.
really connected to like the value of the work they're doing. So they're not growing food that is going to feed their families and their neighbors. They
Right.
are making bolts that will
Yeah.
eventually end up in a train that they will never see, right?
Hmm.
And sort of like the meaning of people's lives is kind of all of a sudden like separated from them.
Hmm. Right.
And this is like a huge thing in the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, alienation, that people just all of a sudden feel like their lives aren't really important or worthwhile because they literally aren't connected to the importance or worthwhileness of their lives. And Shoemaker is really, I think, anti-modern in the sense that he sees connection to the natural world and exposure to kind of traditional people as being like an antidote to alienation, right? And I think this is a
Hmm.
big part of the value of folklore today. So for
For sure.
people who read like the Foxfire books or people who become
Hmm.
interested in like a folk music or a traditional music, right? Part of the appeal of that music is that it's just music for people. It just has to be beautiful and fun
Hmm.
and something for us to do together. When we listen to like the traditional story in a Foxfire book, in some ways we want to hear the story, but we also want to see a person who is living in some kind of like not totally alienated way.
Right.
Someone who has like meaningful connections to their community and the land that they live on, right? That's almost
Right.
the product, right? And
Right.
so Shoemaker is kind of selling us that half a century before Foxfire, this kind of people before alienation. And so that's maybe a little bit of like an overreading of Shoemaker, but I really do think he's responding to that he has
Right.
this sense that there's something wrong with how people are living now, and that wilderness in his imagination is really a solution to that.
Right. And that is without the benefit of like modern psychological studies on why green spaces are important and
Totally.
why urban planning is a thing. Um and it's because it's not like he is someone who is just being contrarian to where industrialism is taking the world just to like sell books to make a living.
Yeah.
Um, like it's not like this is like a path that he's on that he's following other people's footsteps because he's like, oh, if I write books like this, I'm gonna get rich, or
Mhm.
or some other goal, just fame
Yeah.
or whatever. Now, I just mentioned fame right there. One of the things I've always had a hard time getting a good read on is obviously he was popular in his day, being ended up being, the first folklorist and state folklorist. Generally speaking, how was he received by people of his time? We've talked about how he's had the staying power, but at the time, did people get what he was supposedly trying to, as we're speculating, trying to do here? I know we're obviously putting agency onto this.
Yeah.
Um, but was he pretty successful and pretty popular at his time, or was this something that people realized after the fact? Because, like you said, he did this all in almost these short bursts in the early 1900s, and then kind of stayed active for a long time still, but in a
Yeah.
very different way.
Yeah, he really was successful. And I don't have like
I'm gonna try to quantify that now, but
Sure. I
like,
don't have a ton of knowledge of like where his books bestsellers. But he was serialized in all of these newspapers, all of these magazines,
hmm,
particularly like magazines in like Reading and Altoona were publishing
right,
him all the time. He was definitely like a Pennsylvania public intellectual.
hmm,
And I have to imagine his books sold fairly well, just for the simple fact that, he did like 20 of them.
right,
They
yeah,
they must have done okay. The other thing I think that really ended up being a factor in the popularity of his books that he probably couldn't have anticipated when he started was, of course, the invention of the automobile, and then eventually, basically around the 1920s, kind of
hmm,
automobiles that not most, but like a plurality of Americans could afford.
right,
And so travel. This was kind of the
Mm-hmm.
period in which we start to see really like an American travel literature,
Right.
where books that are about, hey, what might you see on the highway in Massachusetts or
Right.
Pennsylvania?
Mm-hmm.
And towards the end of his career, 1930s, 1940s, he actually starts to travel in a car and
Mm-hmm.
write kind of like folklore books where he's gathering stories by car rather than by carriage
Wow.
or by train. Part of the reason I refer to Simon Bronner, the
Mm-hmm.
folklorist who studied him, is because he's the one who really kind of assessed the impact of Shoemaker's work. And according to Bronner, if you have heard of the Pennsylvania mountains as a beautiful getaway with a lot of stories in
Mm-hmm.
it, Henry Shoemaker is the reason you have heard that.
Yeah.
There was not actually like a huge movement to conserve most, but also kind of Scots, Irish, Welsh folklore in the Pennsylvania mountains before Henry Shoemaker. There really
Mm-hmm.
wasn't. And so I think to some extent, yeah, and he in this kind of like local, like Pennsylvania area, not nationally and not globally, he was really popular and successful. Now, by the time we get to the 1940s and 1950s, something kind of interesting happens, which is everybody comes back from basically the American university undergoes this transformation, and all
Right.
of these different academic disciplines suddenly really grow and kind of coalesce and mature.
Mm-hmm.
So these universities kind of explode, and the science of folklore as a kind of recognizable academic discipline really starts to develop. Henry Shoemaker is at first kind of in this club. People kind of
Mm-hmm.
appreciate him, they like him, they read his books, and then they read his books again, and then they read his books again, and they kind of realize
Mm.
this we're I'm hearing a lot of Henry Shoemaker. I don't really know if I'm hearing like the source,
Right.
behind.
Right.
And so he does have some feuds with other Pennsylvania folklorists, among them Alfred Shoemaker, just a kind of
Mm-hmm.
hilariously Pennsylvania German situation that these two guys both happen to be named Shoemaker in a fight with each other. But he keeps writing and working and being published until his death in 1958. And he continues to publish in folklore journals, and in a lot of those later publications, like he's trying to keep up, and he's even kind of like apologizing for his work before, not apologizing in the sense of saying like I'm sorry, but saying like, hey, in 1901 they didn't I couldn't major in folklore, everybody, and I
Yeah.
wanted to write a book that somebody might buy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so he does really try to ingratiate himself into these fields. And of course he's also I forget the exact title, but he's the Pennsylvania first state museum commissioner. The
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania State History Museum in
Oh,
Harrisburg.
really?
He's the first, yeah, he was the
Oh.
first
Oh, interesting.
like
Okay.
commissioner of this after he was the Pennsylvania State folklorist. And he was just like a well-to-do man in sort of like
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania polite society. He had a
Right.
few kind of fancy gigs like that and university appointments. Yeah, so he remained a popular figure in this world. His work was never really, strictly speaking, like critical academic folklore, and it was never
Right.
accepted as such. And I think especially as folklore continued to mature, and then, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the discipline really kind of wants to get away from supernatural stories. Like
Mm-hmm.
folklorists want to be seen as people who can do things other than like listen to stories about witchcraft on a front porch in Appalachia, right? They
Right.
want to
Right.
branch out. And
Mm-hmm.
so they really kind of make a big point of saying what Henry Shoemaker was doing is not folklore. And Simon Bronner publishes Popularizing Pennsylvania in, I believe it's the early 2000s that book comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not saying Henry Shoemaker is actually a great folklorist. We were all wrong. Nor is he saying Henry Shoemaker is someone that we should never pay attention to. He's saying Shoemaker's writing actually had these like political and social motivations that are
Mm-hmm.
really interesting and worthwhile.
Mm-hmm.
And what is maybe more interesting about him than did he ever make up a story is like, did he successfully do what he set out to do? to turn Pennsylvania into a place that people feel like is worth maybe protecting a little bit? And the answer
Mhm.
is just yes, you know,
Oh,
like he did what
yeah.
he wanted to do.
That's a really beautiful way of summing that up, actually, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so we can't directly credit Shoemaker with this because there were a lot of different conservationists working in
Hmm.
Pennsylvania at the time. But Pennsylvania is the only state in the union where every resident must be within a 25-mile
Right.
distance of a state park. That's
Right.
kind of unusual, right?
Yeah. We're very lucky
Pennsylvania,
here. Yeah.
and this is not to say that Pennsylvania is like perfect
Oh,
conservation
far
wise
from.
by any means, you know what I mean?
Far from, but
But we do have this more so than other states, thanks to Henry Shoemaker getting started more than 100 years ago. We do have a little bit more of like a conservationist legacy than a lot of other
hmm
places. And I think we do all kind of have this deep sense when we think about the mountains in the central part of the state, we do kind of
hmm
have this sense like that's a special place where
Right. Right.
special stories happened, right? And interesting people lived. And that's all Shoemaker, the
hmm
reason we feel that way.
No, and I think you really hit on something there that this kind of thread of conservation, because it does come up a lot when we talk about folklore or we talk about, these stories. Was there any contemporaries that were doing similar things to Shoemaker, had similar, like, I guess, like motivations? Like, were the other people doing what he was doing? He was just happened to be more successful at it because of his area or because of his station in polite society, or was doing kind of unique in Pennsylvania or in the East Coast, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good question. He was definitely unique in Pennsylvania. There weren't really authors doing anything like what he was doing in Pennsylvania until quite a bit into the 20th century. We had like
Hmm.
folklorists working in Pennsylvania. He, not necessarily as a folklorist, but as a kind of, maybe if we can call him like a naturalist or someone who was doing like natural history writing. There were
Hmm.
definitely a lot of people doing sort of like regional natural history kind of work throughout mostly the eastern United States at this point, but and this is kind of like rarefied company for a guy like Henry Shoemaker, but towards the end of the 19th century, you have figures like John Muir who are doing this in the western part of the country.
Right.
And they're not, Muir wasn't really interested in folklore, but he was really interested in using written word to make places special and to really say, like, basically, we need to protect this place from market forces because if we don't, it'll be just immediately destroyed.
Right. No,
So,
it's almost like almost reminds me of like Ansel Adams photography, where it's
yeah,
like
sure.
this stuff happens to be beautiful, but now that you see it, does that
Yeah.
does that maybe inspire you to do something else, you know?
Yeah, sure. So he had some contemporaries in that sense. And at the
Hmm.
time there were so many people like this active at the turn of the 20th century here, just before all of the different kind of academic disciplines take the form that they will take in the second half of the 20th century.
Hmm.
Um, the one guy who really springs to my mind in Pennsylvania especially is an amateur historian named Julius Saxa, who actually wrote a lot about Johannes Kelpius and
Oh,
has
okay.
just become a major figure in my life for that exact reason. And Saxa was also somewhat like Shoemaker, pretty fast and loose with like
Hmm.
his source material and with attributing stuff. He was also like really passionate and prolific about preserving Pennsylvania history. And kind of in a similar situation to Shoemaker, he leaves us with a collection of beautiful books, almost none of the information in which is verifiable in any way. And some of which he definitely made up. Also somewhat like Shoemaker. I don't want to use definitely, but like
Well,
as close to definitely as I can get.
right.
Yeah.
Right. I think part of my, I guess, like the lens that I read Shoemaker with is I was introduced to his work around the same time as two other books. Like
Mhm.
I got Mountain Stories by Shoemaker. I got George Sears, like Nusmuck Woodcraft, and I
Oh,
got
cool.
was it Pioneer Life by Philip Tone. All like basically the same summer.
That's awesome.
And yeah, no, which was whenever you're like 15 years old, that's like what you need, you know.
Totally.
Uh, you can get those three books for any kid, and it's going to be formative, I think.
Yeah.
Um, but like I read a lot of those stories from Philip Tome and from Sears, and a lot of them have that same effect of like preserving preserving what was there. So I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there was almost like folklore happening before this,
Yeah. Yep.
that was Pennsylvania kind of centric. So was there anything like those books maybe that that would have influenced Shoemaker in like a literary or academic sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I know that Shoemaker had read not exactly folklore, but like adjacent. So
Mm-hmm.
so the other kind of important part is this is also kind of at the moment when a lot of different historians and also social scientists are kind of interested in the mythologies of different groups of people, not only around the world, but particularly in Europe, as a way
Mm-hmm.
to sort of establish national identity, right?
Oh, okay.
And
Yeah.
in some cases, this project will get sort of ugly when,
Right.
mythologies kind of become the basis for national identities. But you have, for example, like Brothers Grimm is a great
Mm-hmm.
example, right? Of really like what eventually becomes kind of like the basis of German folklore, kind of constructed in real time by these 19th century authors. That again, that's sort of rarefied company for
Mm-hmm.
Shoemaker. I don't think many people would put him on the order of like Brothers Grimm, but that's just, in part because
Right.
Pennsylvania hasn't been the kind of actor on the global stage as Germany has been in the 20th
Right.
century.
Right.
So certainly there are people doing similar things before that, right? I think in part what makes Shoemaker's project a little bit different is Pennsylvania doesn't really have that cultural
Mm-hmm.
identity, right? When
Right.
he's spending time in Center County and Snyder County and up in Potter County,
Right.
there are communities of people, and in some cases, communities of people who have been there for a long time, but
Right.
there's not like a unified kind of cosmology or system behind the stories he's hearing, and he has to kind of pull it together himself.
Right.
So there's a lot of like what I think is pretty clearly like Pennsylvania German ghost and witchcraft folklore, right?
Right.
There's a lot of what he attributes to indigenous people, a lot of which like I'm willing to suspect like maybe did come from some indigenous people he
Mm-hmm.
met in
Right.
Pennsylvania, some of which he probably made up to kind of like aggrandize
Right.
Pennsylvania, right?
Right.
And so there are people who are doing, I haven't really thought about it like this before, but yeah, there are people who are building kind of national mythologies
Mm-hmm.
for a place proactively. What makes Shoemaker's project a little bit different is he doesn't have like, you know, the Kalevala or the Saga of the Volsungs or
Right.
the Eddas. He has
Right.
like this woman who appears 10 times in Pennsylvania Mountain Stories, Granny Myers, who
Yeah.
just knew a ton about witches and werewolves, right?
Right. Right.
In the mountains. And so in some cases, and of course his political project is completely different. He's not trying to like mobilize a coherent body politic around
Mm-hmm.
nationalist identity. He really just wants someone to press the brakes down on lumber, coal,
Right.
and industrialization.
It's a little more pointed,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah,
yeah,
that's interesting. Um, oh, that's a really wild way of looking at it. So I have to ask. I'm going to ask you a wild question now, just because
sure.
we've been very on brand tonight with how deep we've gotten with this stuff. Now, when you mentioned the Brothers Grimm reference, the thing that popped into my head was if Disney was going to do a Disney movie based off of a Shoemaker story instead of a Brothers Grimm story, what do you think it would be?
That's such a good question.
Maybe that's one for your students to get
Yeah.
to see what they come up with.
That's a really good question. And so, unfortunately, Disney does have this history of like extremely fanciful stories about
Right,
indigenous people, which Shoemaker also does, but I don't think
right.
that would be a good thing for them to
No,
make
no,
a
no.
Princess
But
Knitany story. Yeah, that's a great question. I actually do think that in part, it's because the story all of our listeners will know. I also do think it would be a good one, but that story in the foothills I told, I think
Mm-hmm.
you could have a Disney story about that. That is, half of the movie is from the perspective of Jake, the guy who is watching this
Mm-hmm.
hunter, but is sort of thinking it might not be a good idea. Or excuse me, Old Man Rao is the guy. Jake
Yeah.
is the man who actually shoots the panther. And then part of what I love about that story is we really get a sense of the Panthers have a community and a sociality and like basically rules for living.
Mm-hmm.
Panthers have a culture all of their own in that story.
Right. Right.
And they forcibly reestablish it in the wake of like human aggression, like kind
Right.
of wanton, careless human aggression.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that would actually be a really cool Disney story. Half of it is humans, half of it is the Panthers, and eventually
You-
this kind of climactic moment where
Yeah.
like a mate is restored to her partner through this like mysterious act of panther magic by this spring in the middle of the night, and the hunter's guns failing at the last minute.
Yeah.
That'd be a
I
cool movie.
I'm just saying, like I'd watch that.
Yeah.
You have Old Man Rouse, almost the Greek chorus, like bringing everything together and adding the exposition and everything.
Oh yeah,
Um,
totally.
but
And hey, listen, if anyone from Disney is listening
listen,
tonight, my email is I'm happy to accept any kinds of payment. Yeah.
but no, but I think that like that's good context because like people forget that like when we talk about these stories, that's the only thing sometimes separating them from ones that are happening in other cultures is just like, well, you've heard this one. Here's one that is contextually very similar,
Yeah.
just different people, different places, different elements to it. Now, now we did mention that like obviously like you're teaching these students and everything when it comes to Shoemaker. How do your students react to Shoemaker whenever they're learning about him for the first time? Are they having this same like reaction of like falling in love with the Pennsylvania mountains like we do whenever we read it? Or do they approach it from a different angle?
That in general, my I've been really heartened. So it was you never really know what's going to happen when you introduce students to like a new weird primary source. You really
Right.
just don't.
Yeah.
And I know very, very well that just because I love something and I'm obsessed with something, that doesn't mean
Right.
that a whole bunch of 18 to 22-year-olds are going to feel the same way. But
Yeah.
in general, the students really enjoyed reading Shoemaker. Like
Mm-hmm.
I said, he's a great writer. And so his writing is really like flowery and effusive and romantic. And that's a little bit tough, but
Mm-hmm.
he spins a good yarn.
Right.
And that's I think that's the real reason everybody has read him and he's
Mm-hmm.
important today is he knows how to write. But I think one thing that my students have really kind of enjoyed about Shoemaker is first of all, the I said it earlier when he'll have his characters say really important things. So, for example, that woman who says, "Don't be foolish. We can't reckon without
Right.
ghosts." Right?
Yeah.
We ghosts put us help us see where we are in the world in relation to
Mm-hmm.
other things in the world, right? They the students love to kind of like parse little sort of almost philosophical nuggets like that. But
Mm-hmm.
also I think it's obviously the political side of Shoemaker's work is really interesting, right? Just the idea that you can have you don't necessarily need to be an activist to have this sort of like politics animating what you do,
Right.
right?
Right.
And also to have that actually be effective. So it's kind of hard for us to, especially at like the pace of information that
For
moves around
sure.
today, the
Yeah, it's
fact that
different.
yeah, the fact that Shoemaker wrote about 20 books over a period of basically 50 years, and he kind of forcibly reshaped the public perception of central Pennsylvania as like a
Mm-hmm.
worthwhile, special, beautiful place. And he did so almost single-handedly with just like the humph of his imagination and probably a couple of good stories he picked up from
Right.
old folks. That's just kind of intriguing. I think that my students at least have been intrigued by that, right? Because they
Mm-hmm.
all grew up in Pennsylvania, not all of them, many of them grew up in
Mm-hmm.
Pennsylvania or in Eastern Ohio. And the Pennsylvania mountains do have this kind of reputation as like a special place. And
Right.
it's interesting to kind of dive into a primary source and see firsthand you can see where they got that reputation. Actually, you can see exactly the moment when Penn State got its myth, right? We can put a date on it. It was this
Right.
guy who did it. So I think they kind of are intrigued by that, right?
Hmm.
It's cool to see cultural creation happen in real time, especially in a way that isn't actively destructive or like poisonous in some way, you know?
Right. Right.
Yeah.
No, I think that's a great way of summing up how people are still engaging with his work, and kind of getting something out of it. And I think that it sounds like Shoemaker would be pretty excited to hear that people are still having those kind of reactions to his stuff over 100 years later.
I think so, yeah. I think he would be really pretty impressed at how many trees we've let grow back.
Oh, yeah. Seriously. Yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's and it is sad that someone who put so much time and effort into restoring and conserving, doesn't get to see the stuff that we get to see these days.
yeah.
But
You
what's
want to know something amazing, Brendan?
yeah,
He, in
yeah.
his Extinct Animals in Pennsylvania book, he actually says he's talking about what a loss it is that there are no wolves left in Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah.
But and he really is bummed out about this. But he
Mm-hmm.
says there are still canines like foxes and dogs, and
Mm-hmm.
in the West, there's coyotes. And he says, even if we're never able to reintroduce wolves into this state, eventually one of those animals will take their place, and we will have something in the shape of a wolf in the Pennsylvania mountains sooner rather than later. And that is like literally what has happened with like the
Yeah.
coy dogs and the coy
Mm-hmm.
wolves.
Mm-hmm.
That those animals that he talked about have basically become not fully wolf size, but the Pennsylvania mountains are home now to these big canines again.
Right.
In a way that he really like forced, like he said, I think this is what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, and you think about the reintroduction of like the elk and
yeah,
everything. Like
yeah,
it's sad that that Shoemaker might have been on Winslow Hill but didn't get to hear a elk bugling, you know.
yeah.
Um so that's wild. That's wild. Well, so we've covered a lot tonight. So thank you so much for this. And like I said, this is not the last time we're going to have you on, obviously, because like I said, we want to talk about the Kelpia stuff. Like I said, once I get through this book. But in the meantime, is there anywhere you would like to point our audience to follow what you're doing or read any of the work that you've done?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I have a website. If you it's timothygrieve-carlson.net, and that is kind of where all of my stuff is. But yeah, if you Google my name, Tim Grieve-Carlson, you'll find the website, you'll find my social media profiles. A lot of the work I do is academic, but I'm starting to do more popular stuff. And my email is on the Westminster College homepage. So if anyone wants to be in touch, I'm available.
Awesome. I'll make sure to have all of that in our show notes. But if anyone out there would like to reach out to us, we're always looking for more stories and thoughts and comments. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at the Ghost Furnace Podcast or the Ghost Furnace Podcast at gmail.com.